Okay, thanks for coming. I'm so glad to be here at NDC Oslo. Coming to Norway is always feels like coming home. I used to live here, so I'm so happy to be here. Today I'm going to talk about the top 10 Istio security risks and mitigation strategies. For those who have been asking, Istio is a service mesh tool, which is an abstraction of the network layer on top of Kubernetes deployments mainly. Before we start, let me introduce myself. I'm José Carlos Chávez. I am a software engineer at The Trade. At The Trade, we are in the mission of transforming application networking and security for the multi-cloud era, right? Now that we have not only the cloud, but multi-cloud, right? I'm an open source enthusiast. I'm from Peru, and I'm co-leader for the OWASP Coraza project, which is a web application firewall. And I'm also a mathematician in my free times. So, we today are going to talk about risks and mitigation, right? But let's start by introducing what are risks. And risk is mainly defined by likelihood plus impact, right? How easy is it to carry out an attack, right? Does it require a lot of knowledge? Does it require a shallow knowledge about the internals? How hard it is, how cheap it is to launch the attacks, right? Do you need just one client? Can you run it from your browser? Do you need a farm of servers running processes to run the attack? How sensitive is the data or the components that are targeted, right? Are they crucial components in the system? Are they just fine components, ephemeral components, and you just are not worried about them? And most important question is, how sensitive is the data they are targeting, right? Because data, as we learned towards the last 3-4 years where breaches have been happening over the time, data is the most important asset that tech companies hold. And if the data is stolen, how hard is it to recover them, right? These are the kind of questions that you will ask yourself when it comes to, okay, what is the likelihood of this attack to happen and what will be the impact, right? And then we have mitigation strategies, right? And mitigation is basically dealing with the risks, right? You can assume and accept the risk and say okay, it's fine. I will just accept that this could happen, but maybe the likelihood is not big or the impact is not important. You can avoid the risk and say, no, this cannot happen, so I will just put a security measure in front of it to avoid this. You can control the risk and say, up to this point, I will do nothing, but from this point on, I will put a measure and deal with it, right? Transfer the risk, because you could say, okay, this is beyond my expertise, or it's not worth to invest on this in my company, so I will just hire a third party to deal with this, right? You can think of Cloudflare, for example, or whenever you want to operate a load balancer or a WAF or whatever, right? Or watch and monitor, right? Which is basically sitting down and say, okay, let's see what happens, right? I will react accordingly, right? These are the kind of ways you can deal with the risks. But is an Istio secure by default? Why do I care about the security risk in Istio? Because Istio is 79% of service mesh adopters went for service mesh because of security, according to the Kubernetes service mesh microservice. And 22% thinks that the most important asset from bringing in a service mesh is security. But why are we concerned about the security risks in Istio, right? And it always comes down to users, right? Because Istio is not secure or insecure by default. It depends on the trade-offs and the configuration that you make, right? Operating a service mesh isn't easy. It's really complex because it has different components, it has different features that you could decide to enable or not enable because of different reasons, context, legacy, whatever. And getting the configuration right isn't easy either. So that's why what happens with security is that it becomes an afterthought, right? You start with simple, and then sometimes you forget about it, or you say, I will focus on security later, right? And this is why Istio is not secure or unsecure by default. It depends on the way how you configure it. And guess what? Misconfiguration leaves thousands of servers vulnerable to attack, researchers find. Because misconfiguration is probably the most common source of vulnerabilities in their systems, right? The human factor, right? And when we talk about whether something is secure or not, we should also consider the 7 layers of cloud security, right? What are we talking about? Well, we have this model where we have policies, procedures, and awareness, which is mainly focused on the culture of whether the way I build software is secure or not, right? This is more related to the culture of the development teams. You have physical security, which is about devices and the data that you have in the system, right? When you have on-prem, this is more, let's say, obvious, like you have to take security measurements on physical security. When you go to the cloud, you delegate this risk to the cloud provider, of course, and the cloud provider will guarantee certain compliance. You have the perimeter defense, right, which will bulk initial attacks and will discourage further attempts, right? You can have a WAF, you could have a firewall in front of your applications, and then that's the way you will deal with the risk here. You have the internal network security in case the attacker is already in the network, right? There is this concept that has emerged not long ago, and now it's becoming a standard, which is called zero trust, that tells you that you should design your policies as if the attacker was already in your network. So this is all about internal network security. You have host security, which will basically avoid backdoors in the hosts, right, which is also an attack vector in your network. Application security, so you will avoid exploits because of the vulnerabilities that you introduce in your applications by consuming third-party libraries, by not escaping the data, by leaving backdoors in the logic, etc. And then you have data security, right, to protect the most valuable asset in your system, right? So we see that we have different layers of security. So when we talk about whether something is secure or not, we should consider all these. But also when we talk about an Istio deployment, there are different building blocks that will span different layers, right? You have the underlying infrastructure, right? The cluster, the virtual machines, the hosts. You have the Kubernetes platform, which is orchestrating all the deployments, right? And this will span different layers as presented in the previous model. Then you have on top the Istio service mesh, which will bring the observability, the networking features, and it will also deploy the applications, right? So these are the building blocks that you should consider when you are talking about the security of your system, because Istio per se is not something you deploy. You deploy Istio to then deploy the applications, your logical layer, let's say. And this reinforces the principle that security should be redundant, right? Unlike in life, where less is more, in security, more is more and less is less, right? That's why you have these building blocks overlapping each other at some point in different layers. But then, who should I protect my system from, right? Who is the one that is trying to attack me and how, right? Well, we have different threat actors. The first one could be the internal attacker, which is a subject with certain degree of privileges that will try to out-level their privilege and break the trust boundaries, right? Someone who is trying to execute actions that don't belong to their role under certain attack techniques. You have contributors to Istio, basically subjects that will introduce vulnerabilities in Istio to be exploited when they are deployed. These are unlikely, of course, because Istio, being a popular software, goes through different levels of revision by different people, different groups. So it's unlikely, but still it's possible. Contributors to third-party libraries. Istio uses several libraries as a complex software as it is. You don't reinvent the wheel, so you consume third-party libraries. And third-party libraries are, of course, more sensitive to be compromised, right? And then the untrusted users, right, which are the users which have no privilege at all, but they will try to out-level their privileges. They will try to exploit as much as possible what they will find as vulnerabilities in your system. These are the kind of attackers that you will find in a typical Istio deployment. So, what are the risks then, right? Where does this list come from? Well, we built this list based on the security reports that have been published over the last 2 years, 2022 and 2023, focused on cloud-native landscape. It's also based on own experience. We at Trade work a lot with Istio. We also have our own Istio distribution that I will briefly mention later. And also, there is, of course, the OWASP Top 10 Web Application security risks, which inspired this list in a way. So let's start. The number one is unsecure communication, right? And this imposes significant security threats. You have on-path attacks, which is mainly man-in-the-middle attacks, right? Someone in the middle listening to the traffic and then trying to steal information out of that. Spoofing, which is someone trying to have permissions that they are not supposed to have or roles that they are not supposed to hold. Credential stuffing, which is someone stole your credentials and tried to perform traffic as it was legit. Brute force attacks, all this kind of vulnerabilities that try to exploit the fact that you do traffic in plain text, right? And the reason for this is that although Istio comes with the feature of encrypted traffic by default, encrypted communication across components, the pace and the life cycle where you deploy applications in the cloud is not, or is really fast that sometimes you cannot afford to issue certificates as you want. Luckily, Istio has this possibility to auto-issue, having Istio as a known authority auto-issue certificates, so all communication can be secure. The Istio permissive security setting is useful, but it's unsecure, right? It accepts plain text and encrypted traffic. And you might be wondering why in the world am I using unencrypted traffic if Istio enables this or can provide me this functionality? Well, there are different reasons why you would do that. First one is because you want to onboard legacy applications, right? So you cannot enable encrypted traffic by default. Second is because you don't want to roll out these kind of features that apply to the entire organization, the entire architecture, everything at once, right? So you want to roll out this progressively, then you will enable permissive at the beginning. And then the string security setting will force that all traffic might be secure, right? So this is the way to go, ideally, but not necessarily something that you will always do. The way you mitigate this is using enable mutual TLS, which is a very a classical feature from Istio, right? As I said, Istio will be the authority, and then all the communication will be secure. You will use a pair authentication policy, and you can enable per namespace, or you can enable wide organization through deploying this on the Istio system namespace. If permissive mode is required, you can still apply an authorization policy, so you can specifically restrict this permissive mode for certain components. You will listen to me saying the word deterministic many times. But the reason is because, as we will see, everything that is deterministic, that is explicit, is more secure than implicit things. And you can also configure TLS verification for when you are basically through the sidecar that Istio will deploy. You will, let's say, propagate secure traffic, although the original application in the pod will provide a plain text application. And you can create a destination rule that will force to verify that traffic, right, in the target, let's say. So number two, unsafe authorization patterns. Istio allows you to have fine-grained authorization policies for traffic between workloads using authorization policy. Problem is the way you create the policies, right? For example, in this specific example that I'm showing here, you have that you are granting access to all, let's say, destinations, but the private endpoint, which is something that makes sense, right? If it's private, then I don't want to give access. The problem with this policy is what you are saying is that, okay, I don't know what I am granting access to. I know that I am blocking for private, meaning that you're accepting that you don't know who are you granting access to, right? The mitigation is to use default deny, of course, and then whatever you want to allow, you do that explicitly, right? You do allow with positive statement. I allow traffic for these, for endpoint A and B. And then I am denying traffic for everything except endpoint C and D, right? Then you have control on what you are giving access to, right? Specifically, explicitly. Number 3, weak service account authorization or authentication. One of the most important principles in security or in cybersecurity is the least privilege principle, right? A subject should have no more access privilege than the necessary to run their task, right? Still, according to a report from SysDig, 90% of granted permissions are not used or are useless, meaning that we always give more permissions than we should. I was talking to someone in the conference and they said like, yeah, there is this typical case where you give access to something and then that subject keeps coming saying, requesting for more access. So in the end, you give them the maximum access possible, right? Because then they don't bother you. And this is imposing a huge security risks. The same happens in a deployment. For example, init containers have permission to create network policies, right? An init container is something that you run, it's a container that you run before you run your actual application container to prepare stuff, for example, to check that a database is up, right? To check the, or to create certain files in preparation of deploying your application. Still, this is something that should be sandboxed and doesn't have, or only have local impact, not global impact. But it has permissions to create network policies, which is impacting your whole network configuration. You can bypass the outbound traffic policy by impersonating the Istio proxy, right? Because it is a well-known UID. There is this vulnerability in containers where if you mount a value and that value holds files owned by, let's say, a certain user, if you inside a container create a user with the same UID, then you can modify or access the files, right? So that's why you can do the same for Istio proxy, which is a container in the end, right? Now Kubernetes has started rolling out a CRD for sidecars, which has a special treatment, but that is not yet there. Then you have the usage of first-party JOTs, which are JOTs that don't include the audience, meaning that it can be used everywhere, right? Again, it's not explicit, it's not deterministic what you're going to have access to. You just grant access. The mitigation, you can use a CNI plugin, a container network interface plugin, to avoid requiring the init containers to have the capability of creating network policies. You can require containers to run as non-root, which is probably a very important thing to enable, but there are containers and not, let's say, not few images, popular images I'm talking about, that require to run as root in 2024. So this is not something you can always control. You can use third-party JOTs, which will include the audience, and then the access is deterministic. Number 4, BOLA, Broken Object Level Authorization, right? Istio provides authorization policies to perform checks on HTTP headers, on the path. Kubernetes metadata plugin will add the origin and destination. You can do the checks on that. And you can do validation JOTs, right? The problem is that although Istio can access to the JOTs, it does not understand all the fields in the JOTs. It cannot access all the fields in the JOTs. So for example, Out0 will issue a JOT and then it will include some metadata about business logic, right? Istio doesn't know about it and doesn't have to know about it, right? because it's specific, but then it cannot do much smart authorization on that. And the other problem is that policies get out of sync easily with the architecture. We're talking about here mainly, or at least in a big part of it, we're talking about microservices. The architecture changes constantly, the structure changes constantly. And if you have a system of policies where you have to modulate the permissions into the system and then roll out in your organization, it's easy to get out of sync. What you're looking for here is authorization systems like NGAC, Next Generation Access Control by NIST, or OPA, where you can modulate your world and you can modulate the policies based on the real world, on your current state, right? For example, in NGAC, you modulate everything as a graph, and then you build the policies out of the graph. And the graph will represent your reality. You don't have to turn your reality into the model. And also, all access decisions have to be based on least privilege, of course, principle. It should be per request, it should be context-based, right? Let's say, every single request should include a context so you can do a security posture evaluation every time. According to Benafi, in the report, in the Cloud Native report in 2023, 25% of security issues are caused by poor airbag policies. So this is also important. Supply chain vulnerabilities. And this is probably one of the most popular topics that have been happening over the past 2-3 years after we started with Log4Shell, right? It went over after other. 82%, according to the Benafi report, say that the organizations are vulnerable by cyber attacks focused on supply chain. And Istio itself uses several images and several open source components on third-party code, like Envoy, like Prometheus. And a typical Istio deployment also includes several images as part of the application components, right? From different sources. So some of the risks are image integrity, like how do you know that the image that I am downloading is exactly what the author of the image published, right? How do you know that it wasn't modified? Because in the end, a Docker image is a set of layers that you. How do you know that when it comes to image composition, for example, how do you know that all the layers, all the components that were added on each layer are secure, right? And there are also the known software vulnerabilities, right, that are disclosed, the CVEs, for example. The way you mitigate them is, of course, doing image scanning, right? Having a curated registry where you know that all the images that are there are secure and are safe to use. You can inspect the software bill of materials, which is also trendy these days. The software bill of materials is basically a list of components that were used to build this artifact. And then you can check them. You can check the version and say, like, okay, this doesn't have vulnerabilities, or this does have vulnerabilities. Image signing. Tools like Cosign, for example, allow you to verify that the image is exactly as it was produced by the author, is signed by the author. Well, curated registry, I already mentioned that. And web application firewall to patch vulnerabilities, right? Because one of the problems about open source software specifically talking is that whenever they disclose a vulnerability, this vulnerability has to be triaged, it has to be fixed. Once it's fixed, it will go a pull request that will be merged, then you have to trigger a release, and then if we, for example, talk about Istio and Envoy, if this vulnerability happens in Envoy, then Envoy has to do a release, then Istio has to, because Istio doesn't use, let's say, it doesn't use directly the image of Envoy, Istio uses the Istio proxy, which is based on Envoy, will consume that version, will do a release for the Istio proxy, then will do a release for Istio, and then you have to do the release in your system. That takes a lot of time. The way you fix this is that you put a WAF in front, you patch the network and say, like, all the traffic that looks like the exploit of this vulnerability is going to be blocked. So you fight the symptom, you don't fight the root cause, because the root cause will fight another front, and it will take longer. In the meantime, you patch it. Ingress traffic capture limitation. This is interesting, because Istio Sidecar is supposed to hook inbound and outbound traffic, right? However, for example, it does not support UDP traffic as of now. This issue is still open. So all the traffic will be directly passed to the upstream application. The inbound capture is disabled on ports used by the Istio proxy, or the sidecar, sorry, including the port 22, which is a critical port, right? The way you mitigate this is that you roll out network policies, right? For example, for UDP traffic, you can define firewall rules, implemented as a namespace level. You can do pod-based, you can do IP-based, right? So this also shows us that although Istio is a known tool, and it has its own features, and it runs on top of Kubernetes, it cannot, let's say, divorce from Kubernetes reality, right? You still have depend on your Kubernetes configuration to run this securely. Egress traffic is kind of the same story. You cannot guarantee that all the traffic will go through the sidecar, the egress traffic, right? Actually, there is a feature or a setting called outbound traffic policy for registry only, but you can bypass that. That's not a security issue. And actually, 42% of the respondents of the last Benafi security report said that the security issues were related to network breaches. So this is also a pretty popular problem. The mitigation is like you define network policies for egress, the same way you will do for ingress. You can do run check on Linux calls, right? Let's say an attacker is already in your pod and is trying to send information to an external host, right? So the way you will detect that is through, let's say the attacker installed curl, or curl was already installed, and then it started doing curl to external destination, right? Since it's not being captured by the sidecar, that traffic, you could actually look at Linux calls, right? Tools like Falco report these kind of things. You will detect that there are external calls, and then you will take actions accordingly, right? And then you can also run anomaly detection on the outbound traffic, right, to find what are the anomalies. Observability and monitoring failures, right? Observability and monitoring are crucial for security mitigation. One of the cool things about observability is that it allows you to understand what is happening in your system. When observability started back in 2015, let's say, as a movement, it always have been trying to be connected to controllability, right? Like you should control what you observe. And specifically talking about security, security and controllability is the perfect match, right? So you should be able to take action based on what you observe. Observability is not a goal itself. Like collecting observability data is not something that you should aim, but what you do with that data, right? The problems with observability in your system are that, first of all, you have the log level paradox, which means that when you need a certain log level in your system to understand a security incident, you don't have it because it's too verbose. But when you have it, you don't want it because it's too verbose, right? So, and in security, the problem is that you will have thousands of logs of a blocked attack or an unsuccessful attack, and then you just need one success to get into the system, right? So if you don't enable the right, see, if you enable two verbose logs, you will see the thousands of logs of the failed attack. If you disable that, you won't see the one single attack that was successful that got the attacker into your system. So yeah, that's a problem. One way to mitigate the log level paradox is that you do wise aggregation of the logs, right? Machine learning to understand what logs is useful or not. Insufficient or inadequate audit logs, right? Because logs should, or audit information in general should give you a trial path to understand what happened, why someone had access to this resource at this very moment with this permission or with this role, right? Then you have lack of context, broken correlation, right? Sometimes you have logs, but you cannot connect the dots because, yeah, there is no context propagation. So you don't, okay, in this component, this happened, in this component, this happened. They kind of match for the timing, but you don't exactly know how it happened, right? So mitigation are ensure access logs and error logs are emitted correctly, implement an organization-wide format on logs, like a JSON schema, for example, of what a log should contain. Log data should be redacted correctly because it can also have PII, it can have sensitive information. And if you store it, then it's a potential risk of steal data, right? And ensure high-value transactions have an audit trail, as I said. Like you can use distributed tracing for that, right? There you and Istio something that Istio provides out of the box is distributed tracing. With distributed tracing, you basically can understand how a request traverses your services in the architecture component by component, right? It can more or less thought of as an action replay. Then we have vulnerable Istio versions, of course, because Istio has its own vulnerabilities, right? Older versions might contain known vulnerabilities that have been addressed in later versions, of course. Some are denial of service attacks, CVEs, bypass Istio policies, cryptographic problems. That's why things like FIPS exist, FIPS compliance, to assert that you use the right cryptographical libraries. Mitigations are different. You can use compliant Istio distributions. For example, the trade has one, which is FIPS compliant. You can track the CVE databases looking for a CVE that was disclosed for that your particular Istio version. You can follow Istio security bulletins. And you can, again, have a web application firewall to patch the network and to avoid these risks. And finally, lack of incident response and recovery plan. And this is interesting because incident response in service mesh is more complicated than the classical incident response, right? Because the lack of physical access to the components, right? You cannot access to the server, go open a door and then connect to the terminal of a server. Everything is in the cloud, you don't know where it is. Where is it deployed? Like how many redundant pieces are? The accelerated deployment life cycle, like running forensics on components that live really or have a short life, or trying to make sense of what happened on a component that doesn't exist anymore because it was redeployed, because it was an ephemeral container, because it was a Lambda, or whatsoever. It's complicated. There is a diffuse perimeter, right? Because before we know that, okay, everything that is in my servers is my system. Now in the cloud, the multi-cloud, the Lambda era, it's kind of hard to understand where are the boundaries of the perimeter, right? And lack of observability is also another problem. And actually, the word will be lack of telemetry, right? Telemetry is the right term to understand or to grab information from something that is far away. So yeah, being proactive about anomalous behaviors is crucial to run effective incident response, right? You can do proactive observability with signal analysis and anomaly detection, right? Trying to find the outliers. Ability to do fine-grained policies for reach mitigation, right? Whenever you know that someone is in or an attacker is in, you want to apply policies to kind of, this is called to jail in the attacker to basically restrict their access. Web application firewall, again, to block attacks. You can, if it's a denial of service attack, if you want to block specifics, specific path from a specific IP, a specific user agent, these kind of things can be solved with a web application firewall. Mechanism to rotate credentials on demand, that's also important, because once a credential is compromised, you want to rotate it right away. You don't want to wait until it can be exploited longer. And redundancy of core components for degraded service, right? Because you still want to be up. You don't want to turn down everything just because of a security incident. Because you cannot afford that, right? We are talking about here cloud services. We're talking about here services as a part of a business. So you cannot just say, I will shut down everything. You need to still function it maybe in a degraded mode. One interesting information, according to SysDig, the security company, is that attackers with a stolen credential can inflict damage as in little as in 10 minutes. And I read as well that security breaches takes an average of 6 months to be discovered. So still we have a lot of work to do when it comes to incident response and recovery plans. Consequences of security incidents, which in the end means impact on revenue. You have delayed of application launch, right? Because of a security incident, means that delay on a campaign, delayed on a product launch, or whatsoever. That means impact of revenue. Slowed productivity of the cluster. Negatively impacted customer experience. Again, impact on revenue, reputation. Disrupted application service. Led to a data leak or a breach in 30%. Led to a network compromise, 30% as well. Negatively impacted developer experience, right? Caused an outage and led to compliance violation or audit failure. And this one is probably the one that has less respondents, but probably one of that has a huge impact when it comes to governmental regulations and to keep a business up and running, right? This comes from the Benafi report, the impact of machine identities on the state of cloud native security 2023. So, conclusions. First of all, most of security risks are related to configuration mistakes, right? Naive and non-deterministic security policies is probably the biggest sources of risks in security. Always prefer explicit over relying on defaults or auto capabilities, right? Because what is not explicit, you cannot know what it is, right? And cause more uncertainty. It's hard to track down. So always prefer explicit. No single component or function will be sufficient to achieve a good level of security, right? But collectively, like overlapping security measures will give you a good level of security across all your infrastructure, right? And this is very important because you will see that most of the security measures that people take in the cloud are like complementary, that they overlap and they provide the same information. But once one is down, then the other one is up to back the defense, right? And also policies have to be defined based on the assumption that the attacker is already inside the network. This is one of the core principles of Zero Trust, for example, that you will, all the policies must be, when we say Zero Trust, we actually mean zero implicit trust, right? So you always design the policies in a way that, okay, what if the good guy becomes a bad guy, right? And that's it. Thank you, everyone. If you have any question, I will be more than happy to answer, but thank you anyways. Sure.
Do you have any recommendations for generating software bill of materials that's maybe free and open source?
I know there are projects like, for example, this called Salsa, that allows you to deal with software bill of materials. It depends on where are you or how are you using the software bill of materials. Like, of course, if you have an artifact that provides all the list of dependencies that have been used, then you can track down what happened with these dependencies and where are they vulnerable. And personally, I have been thinking of that in other environments more aggressive or less, let's say, verbose about their dependencies, like, for example, when you have a compiled binary or a WebAssembly binary, like how do you make sure that they meet certain requirements without the software bill of materials? Like, it's hard to track down. I would say, personally, I think this software bill of materials solves the problem of compliance, but not necessarily solve the problem of making sure that the dependencies are secure enough.
Yeah, it's not remediation. It's just that like we're on a multi-stack situation here. There's a lot of vestigial like microservices that are still living in the mesh. So you have Node and you have a bit of Django, and obviously we have the images that need to run that are living up in Artifactory. So there's like you have the bill of materials and dependencies that are just like that form your infrastructure. Then everything that forms that portion of it. So like what version of Terraform are you running? Like what CI/CD, what version of checkout, like all of this kind of stuff. And then you have the actual like the packages that are running within it, like the actual logical workloads, and they're their own thing. Like you have your crypt dependencies, and you have your node dependencies, like your package JSON. So it would be interesting to have something that can at least generate that list overall. So you can parse it and be like I don't know, query GitHub Enterprise and be like, we understand dependabot says this was vulnerable since whatever. We've been running this version according to our bill of materials. It contains this package. It has been vulnerable for the past 6 months. We can kind of target that as like big red critical, 9.8, etc. and be like, this sucked. We should address it. Same thing for like Artifactory and stuff like that, because you have the data sources, like Amazon can scan images for us, so we can know the vulnerabilities inside images. Falco can, or sorry, not Falco, but Datadog's vulnerability monitoring feature can scan runtime dependencies and see stuff that's loaded into memory. You can see that. So like, if you could collate all of those, be able to understand that, that would be helpful. And I think an SVOM is a start for that.
Yeah, but so then my main, let's say, reluctancy around that, which I believe is really valuable, but like as you said, like this has been vulnerable for the last 6 months, right? But how do you know that you are using the function that is vulnerable? Like it imposes you like a huge rig on.
That's the problem. Is that like me and the other staff second, we go spelunking through the code, and sometimes it's like 7 dependencies deep, and we're like, we have never used this source path.
Yeah.
But the thing is, we can't guarantee that we won't.
Exactly. So
it's like you check or you don't. It doesn't matter because you never guarantee that you're like you can't issue bulletins to your developers and be like, hey, by the way, Lodash is vulnerable here at this version. We've never used that function, but also never use it.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is the thing, right? So you don't know whether you use it or not, and it will give you a huge red flag because it's vulnerable. And the problem is not that, okay, it will take you time to fix it, but like the prioritization is probably one of the problems here because you will know which one is, for example, and this is in interpreted languages, I would say is way more hard to track down. Yeah. Yeah, if, for example, I have been working in WebAssembly a lot for a while as a user. And there what happens is that you consume the function, you put the function that you're using. You don't import the whole thing, right? And then you have more control on what could be vulnerable, but that's a compile time, right? But for example, if you want to detect whether you use something at runtime, it's really complicated because how do you know do you use that function? Because maybe you use it, or maybe you don't. But the only way you can guarantee that you use it or not is by real traffic, right? By production traffic, and then you have to go to profiling, and yeah, it's a controversial topic, I would say. It works for compliance, but I'm not 100% sure it gives you the right sense of security, or at least the prioritization on what should I tackle.
It doesn't. You still need a lot of manual labor.
Yeah. So yeah, that's my. I consider this is something important, specifically talking about open source and popular images. For example, if you think about like Docker images that you will use as from open source, they are adjusted and they are like shrinked to the point that you only include what you need. And there you can have a better sense of what is vulnerable or not. But like otherwise, yeah, it's really complicated. Another question? Nope. Okay. Thanks for coming. It was lovely to be here. Thank you. Have a good day.